Yeah, off we go.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sort of assuming that most people know what uSync is, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail of exactly what it does. But I thought, given we got 10 minutes, we could race Azure DevOps and do the deployment with an Azure with a uSync in the background and see what happens. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So has everyone got that yet? So the basics of uSync, if you don't know, it's really simple, is it takes the bits of your Umbraco database that are like your doc types and your content and your media types and everything, and it writes them out to disk in XML format. And then you can then copy them to another server, another site, and it'll import them. So from a user interface point of view, normal uSync hasn't got much going for it. It's got in the background, it's got all the files. Every time you go into a piece of content, if you've got Content Edition installed, and you do an update like that, a simple update to my site, then obviously you don't see anything, but in the background, uSync's just saved that change to disk so that it's all there. And if you copy that to another site, those changes get applied as well. From a development point of view, if you're just using it to copy those files around, you can run a report and it'll tell you the differences with the stuff that's on disk to the bits that are on the site. So you can see I've manually hacked it a bit so that you can see them. So we can go in and you can see the differences. Are you, like Nathan, this is using some of the core stuff to show the differences between the files. Slightly different layout because there's non-content stuff it shows you as well. So you can see the difference in the content type. So this is the sort orders being swapped. And then you can run an import of them. And essentially it imports those changes across. It should also be said, I'm running on a dev version at the moment of the latest, so this might well break, but we'll see. So what you can do, what was originally built for was source control. So the idea was that all of those bits went into your source control. And then from there, one of these will be my source control. So from your source control, you have all your uSync files. And if another developer comes along, they can pick up the site. They've got all the config, they run an import, and they've basically got an Umbraco site with all of your settings. So your developers can work on the same sites, but have totally separate databases. But another thing it's quite good for is deployment, it turns out, in terms of if you want to get your site from one place to another just quickly, you can use uSync to do that. So what we've done here, if I go back to the code, I should have a couple of changes. So we will deploy updates. Let's give it a good name. So if I just commit those updates to my source control, I'll start it off and then talk through what it does because it takes about 5-10 minutes to deploy. So 7 minutes, it'll be a race. So what we've just done there is pushed to this repo, which is in Azure DevOps. You can see all we've really done is update some content. Now, what I've got in the background configured for this is I've got a build pipeline and a release pipeline in Azure. So if you've not seen this, it might be interesting, but it's not complicated. So what we've got is an Azure build pipeline. So these are just my random test builds, but this one is for here. And you can see it's already kicked off. So that is now building this project. So if we edit this, I'll just show you the config while it does it. It takes about 2 minutes. So what we have is we've connected this to that repository in Azure. So every time that's done, I think we've got triggers on. So every time someone pushes to master, this process will run. And it's really simple. This is like the default one. You can do this in fancy YAML if you like that, but I'm already old school on DevOps and I use the UI because it makes sense to me. And essentially this just gets gets all the feeds I've got. Because I'm using dev versions, I'm using an internal feed to get my version of uSync. And then it builds that solution. And there's nothing fancy here. This is what happens if you just say, I want to build an ASP.NET website. It gives you all this command line. And then it publishes the artifact. So if I go back to my pipelines, it will still be in progress because it'll even take longer. When you demo these things, it takes a minute, it'll take 4. But you can go in and you can see, you'll get emails when this happens, but essentially this just runs through. You can see at the moment it's building. It's just building the Umbraco site. So it's going to create a big zip file with all of Umbraco in it and uSync stuff in it. And then it publishes that back up to Azure. And so it doesn't do anything clever. That's not gone anywhere. It's not gone to any sites. It's just built your site. Obviously, you've got all sorts of little bits of content in there. It's built them as well. And then when that does build, and when it publishes, we have a release. Now, I do it like this because that means that you can have one build and multiple releases. So on this release, which will kick off as soon as that pipeline's finished, which it'll go slow. Let's just quickly see where it's up to. Oh yeah, it's just finishing. So from the release side, we'll wait for that to start, but essentially we have a release that says, again, here's our build that we've just done. And when that's finished, I think we've also got a trigger on. When the build's finished, it will automatically apply. You wouldn't normally have that going live, that someone commits to something, it automatically builds and automatically deploys, because so that might break stuff. And in here, we have a deployment task. And again, this is quite simple. We are deploying to Azure. So when you've got your Azure configuration, you get a load of drop downs essentially. And you say, this is the one I want. This is my Azure I'm using. This is my website I want to deploy it to. And there's a couple of little things. And the only thing that's going on to all of this that we do that you might see is this, we place tokens. So within the release, we have the variables, which are our Umbraco connection string. We update the client dependency number to the build so that it updates every time you build the site. And then a couple of uSync things. So not syncing content on the site and not importing at startup. I'll go into uSync bits in a second, show you. But essentially that will build the site. And you can see it's deploying. And when it's deployed, we have a copy of the site on Azure with potentially with the updates. Now it's not quite there, but essentially that's the way all the way through. So that's what quite a lot of people use Azure Umbraco uSync for now. And there's only a couple of things you have to do to make that work. So you can see in the config, we've got a couple of uSync settings in the web config. The thing that you don't know is you can have them in the uSync 8 config file, which says imported startup, don't start. These are the things to sync, but you can also chuck them in the web config because it's easier to configure. And say, deploy at startup. The default handler. So when I'm working locally, it's using the default handler, which in my uSync is everything. So it'll sync all the content locally. But when I deploy it, I deploy with no content, which means it doesn't sync content and media when it gets deployed. So you just sync in all the settings. So your developer gets all the settings on the live server, but obviously not their development content. And then that parameters thing, which I use to set like the client dependency. So this is a built-in Umbraco feature. I mean, not Umbraco, Windows feature, which is if you've got a parameters.xml in your project, when you build your project, it will go through using the XPath to find values in any of your config files, and you can replace them with the like strings that then you can use in the release process to say, so we say find the version value of the client dependency. And then you saw in our deployment step, I think I'm not on the right one now. We had a value that said update the version. So when it gets deployed, it increments the client dependency as well. So that deploys your whole site in a couple of simple steps. I say simple, they're quite hard to work out once you've done them. They're simple setup, but there can be a lot behind them if you want to. So that's actually deployed. So I don't think it really matters because you're not going to see anything. And that's the deployed site, and that's now live on Azure, and the updates would get applied. I think we've got it turned off, so the updates wouldn't necessarily get applied automatically, but you could just have them apply automatically. And that gets all your content from uSync up to your site with very little faff, really, especially if you're doing development and stage. And that's a bit whirlwindy, but one of the things you can use uSync for. Very quickly, because I've got 1 minute. I'll show you the other side. If you wanted to push your content, obviously you could still do it with uSync, and you could still do what's my changes, and you can import them, and you can do all that. But what you can do with uSync Complete, which is the other package that sits on top of uSync, the paid one, is you can connect the servers. So you can say from my local dev server, which is this one, I can have it connected, so I can then go and right click and do publish to. Pick my demo site, which is my Azure site. Say I want to publish everything that's changed, and it will take all the content changes from my dev site in this case, do a report, tell me what the differences are in the content. So again, you can go in and see where you've made changes to content, and you can publish that to the server, and it will publish the files and the media and everything from your development site or your stage site, say in more reality, to your live site. So that's published all the content settings. And you can do the same with media. So you can go there and you can push all your media to your other server. I think it's identical. So it'll probably just say there's no changes. That's the end of that. And very quickly, because I'll just sneak this in, the other thing it has is the ability to remotely browse the other site. So from the what is my local site, I can go in and say, what's my demo site? And it'll go, this is what my demo site. Currently they're all in sync because we've just pushed the sync. If we go in here and change something locally, but it might be the other way around. You might have the, right, you could go in and it'll tell you that they're different. And you can see that this page on the live site is now different from the one that we were looking at. And so you can select that. And if you wanted to pull it back down from the live site, you could say, I want that page. It's only that page, so we don't care about children. And now we've got that page back. And it doesn't refresh, which is one of the things I wanted to work on. Very, very quick. Sorry, it was a lot. Any questions? Anything anyone wants to actually me to go into detail in? Anything else you want to see?
Would it be possible to save all the dev files in a storage account, in a blob storage?
You can move them, yeah. It's not. I'm not 100% sure if they'll go to blob storage. They might not. They go through the core file system service inside uSync that does save anywhere, but I can't remember if it saves in blob. So the uSync publisher supports all the blob stuff because actually most of it's in memory. The traditional, like normal uSync is just saving to a folder. So you define where the folder is here. I think it's changed in V8, the way the file system provider works. So on V7, you used to be able to just use the file system provider and say, I want this folder to be in blob. And I've not really messed about with it much, but I know there's a different one for media and a different one for forms now. So I think you might need a different one if you wanted to then put a different folder into blob storage. You could potentially move it into media, but I have a sneaking feeling that bit won't work. Moving all your media into Azure does work. But yeah.
Kevin, one of the things which I just noticed while looking for courier and things like that, I see that for Umbraco 8, there's going to be no courier. They're thinking about deploy, but what they are pushing forward is to use uSync instead of courier. If that's the case, and with this, is that correct for one thing? And the next thing is, if you're using that, how would you be able to move content? I think you demoed it to move content across environments, and is that the sort of preferred workflow with when using uSync as well?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. There's Umbraco deployers in development. It has been for over 12 months. It gets its deadline moved every now and again. I believe it's close, but I don't know how it works. I've never used it. In terms of uSync, it sort of stands alone from that. So most people I speak to use it in a sort of combined way, which is they do the deployment I just demoed, where they deploy their settings and then they use uSync Publisher on top to publish content to media, or their editors use it to move content from stage to live. You can do either or. So you can set up, when you set up a server for Publisher, and you can have multiple servers. I'm going to do this now. It won't work because obviously I haven't got a URL, so it's just going to die. But it'll just complain it can't find it. These are the common options. So deployed sync is all your everything's deployed, and then your content and media is added on top. You can do a full sync where everything is deployed. So from uSync Publisher, you can say all of my dependencies, all of my files. When someone right clicks and does send, everything goes. And that way, your two sites aren't linked by building. They're just copying everything between them. And you can actually sort of go from a setup site. So I'm on demo site here. I could just push from here. I can do push settings. And I can choose, I want to push all my document types. I can even do, it won't work on this exact version, it works on the previous version, include system files, and it'll publish any DLLs that aren't core Umbraco DLLs. So if you've built your project and you've got like an extra DLL, it'll push that to the live site over the wire Obviously, that will reboot your live site, which is why it's got a big yellow warning box. So you can do it this way, but people sort of tend to do a mix. Sometimes people even just don't publish the content. So it depends on how people work, because a lot of people are using Azure. Some people are just using servers. Some people have full control over what they deploy. Others sort of have a site that they've got working and they can't really connect to it. And this allows you to connect and sort of push and pull back.
Cool. I think we might have a few more questions later on. But one thing before I let you go, with media files, there's this full support for media files in uSync now, with uSync public.
Yeah, well, the uSync will completely sync your media files. Normally, uSync will take them. It won't obviously copy the files. It creates the XML file. You'd have to, if you were just using uSync, you copy the uSync folder in the media folder, and then if you import it, it'll work. On uSync Publisher, wherever your media is stored, it'll be pushed. So if it's stored in Azure or AWS or however, then when you push it across, it's compared and it's sent across the wire between the two servers.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin.